Episode 1. A feather fell on the altar. They found the feather on the altar, but no bird had entered the church. No wind had stirred. No window was open. The feather was long, pure white except for its tip, dipped in something dark. Not ink, not blood, something. Altar. Father Malrick stared at it, frowning. It was only a feather. But every instinct in him, every scripture he had memorized, every ritual he had recited, every prayer he had whispered to heavens dreamed. That was not a feather from a bird. That was a feather from an angel, and it was afraid. That same night, a page tore itself from the church Bible. No one touched it. No one heard it move. But the next morning, it lay curled on the pulpit like it had been weeping all night. A single name had been underlined, burned, not inked. Adramiel. Father Malrick didn't recognize it. Not in canon, not in Apocrypha, not in the down scenes of texts he'd studied over 20 years of priesthood. He took it to the archdiocese. They sent it back, unmarked, no comment. So he went further. He sent it to a Vatican archivist he trusted. The man replied within hours, just for words, "Don't speak that name," and then he went missing. The next day, a child came into the church and asked the priest a strange question. Why does the angel outside cry when he hears that name? Father Malrick blinked. What angel? The child pointed to the steeple, the one with no mouth, but it still weeps. The priest rushed outside. Nothing. No statue. No shadow. No presence. Until they turned back toward the church and saw something carved into the stone above the entrance. Something that had never been there before. A single wing, broken, facing downward. That night, the Bible refused to close. Its pages trembled in candlelight. Verse after verse turned themselves violently, as if trying to find something or avoid something. And done. Every angel's name in the scripture burned out. Michael, Gabriel, Uriah, all gone, all vanished into smoke between the lines, except one. One name remained untouched. One name glowed red, Adramiel. And somewhere in the church, though no one else was there, Father Malrick heard something fall to the stone floor behind him. Another feather, this one black, and it was still warm. Episode 2. The Angel Without a Mouth. Father Malrick didn't sleep. He Saturday in the sanctuary all night, eyes fixed on the Bible that now trembled when touched. Every time he blinked, the name still burned into the page. Adramiel. Not written, not printed, branded. By dawn, the candles had melted down to bone-white wax puddles, and the second feather, the black one, had vanished. He didn't imagine it. The stone where it fell was still warm. He rang the bell at 6 a.m., but no one came. Not a soul. That had never happened before in St. Anselm's. Even on snow days, the elderly still arrived early to light candles and whisper trembling prayers. But this morning, the pews stayed empty, as if the town had been warned by something older than weather. At noon, a woman appeared at the back of the church. She didn't walk in. She stood at the threshold, frowning, like she could see something Malrick couldn't. She whispered, "It's above you." He turned. Nothing. Just the crucifix. And then, a faint sound. Not a voice. Not air. A scraping, like metal being dragged across stone. From inside the walls, the woman's lips trembled. "He has no mouth," she said, "but he remembers every time the name was spoken." She placed a small parchment on the floor, then left without another word. Malrick opened it slowly. Inside, a stitch. An angel, one wing folded downward, chains wrapped around its torso. And where the mouth should have been, only skin. Sur, silent, sealed, written underneath in Latin. He was the last one who tried to write a name. That night, Father Malrick stayed again, but something was different. The mirrors in the sacristy no longer reflected him. Only the pews, only the walls, never his own form. And then, at 3:13 a.m., every candle lit itself, simultaneously, and above the altar, a shadow formed, not cast, formed, a figuretto, robed in black that bled upward into the rafters. Its wings tucked so tight they looked broken, and though it had no mouth, it was weeping. Blood ran down its chinless face, and when it pointed one long finger toward the Bible, the name Adramiel began to pulse. Not go, pulse, like a heart, like something beneath it was waking, or worse, remembering. Episode 3: The Name That Heaven Never Spoke. By morning, the church walls had begun to crack, not with age, with resistance, as if something inside St. Anselm's was trying to expand, but the stone was still pretending it could hold what was coming. Father Malrick stood in front of the Bible, hands trembling. He hadn't touched it since the second feather fell, but the name Adramil was now carved deeper than ink. It throbbed like a wound that didn't want to heal. He whispered, "What are you?" No answer, only silence. But it was dense, pressing, like standing beneath deep water, like something was listening from beneath the words. That afternoon, he drove to the diocesan archive, a locked building where forbidden texts were stored, some censored by Rome, others too old to categorize. He asked for Codex 414. The clerk looked at him as if he had just requested a demon's birth certificate. "No one touches that book," she said. "Not even the bishops." "Why?" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "Because the last person who did forgot how to pray. Back at the church." Malrick opened the codex. No title, no binding, just loose pages bound with a black ribbon and a single line scratched into the leather cover. "The angel who knew what God feared." Page after page listed names. Celestial, divine, some familiar: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, others erased, crossed out violently, except one, Adramiel. Next to it, a single sentence written in a trembling hand. He was not cast down. He walked away. Malrick felt a cold sweat crawl down his spine. Angels were created to obey. To leave heaven wasn't rebellion. It was something worse. It was knowledge. He turned the page and saw an illustration so faint it looked burned in instead of drawn. An angel kneeling before a human child, hiding his face, not in worship, in terror. Below it, the only name that silences angels is the one that remembers before obedience. That night, Malrick returned to the church, and the robed figure was waiting for him. No mouth, no movement, just those tears, still weeping, still bleeding. But tonight, the angel lifted its hand and pointed again, not at the Bible, at Malrick. And then, for the first time, the name Adramiel whispered itself into the room, not as sound, but as memory, and everything that Malrick believed began to unravel. Episode 4: The Prayer That Wasn't Meant for God. Father Malrick couldn't speak, not because he lacked words, but because his mind had gone still, the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from staring into something so ancient, so forbidden, that the brain forgets how to process reality. Adramiel, the name no angel would say, the name the Bible once tried to erase but couldn't, the name now alive on the page, pulsing like a vein beneath scripture. And it had pointed at him. It tried to pray, but the words came out wrong, bent, backward, like something in the air was rearranging language itself. He collapsed to the floor, and unguided, mouthless, chained in memory, stepped forward. No footsteps, no sound, only movement. And then, the air around Father Malrick shifted. He wasn't in the church anymore. He was in a placeholder, not hell, not heaven, somewhere in between. It looked like a garden, but everything was wilted. A tree stood at the center, its bark covered in names, some glowing, some scratched out, one burned deeper than the others. Adramiel. Then he heard it, a prayer, but it didn't come from above. It came from beneath, a soft, female, fragile. Please don't let them erase him. He didn't lie, he only remembered. Father Malrick turned. A woman stood near the tree, but she wasn't human. Her eyes were mirrors. Her breath moved the grass, but her feet never touched the ground. She looked at him not with fear, not with anger, but with recognition. "You're the first one to hear the echo," she said. "What echo?" he whispered. She stepped closer. The prayer that was never meant for God. And then the scene shattered. The church returned. Malrick guessed awake on the stone floor, heart racing. Adramiel was gone. Only one thing remained. The Bible wide open had turned to a page that didn't exist. There was no chapter, no verse, only a handwritten sentence. The first lie was obedience, and beneath it, something had been scratched into the page with a feather. A sigil. It pulsed red. It moved, and in the center of it, written in a language he did not know, but somehow understood, a warning: if he remembers everything, then even God will have to answer. Episode 5: The Feather in the Confessional. The sigil wouldn't stop pulsing. Father Malrick closed the Bible, locked it inside a brass box, and sealed it under the altar. But even then could hear it, like a heartbeat, like it was alive. The church grew colder each night. The crucifix above the pulpit began to tilt slightly, too slowly to notice unless you stared for hours, but enough to make the figure of Christ look like he was turning his head away. Then came the whispers. At first, only during prayer, soft static under the words of Scripture, like a voice beneath the page trying to speak through holy text. By the third night, they had moved into the walls, and always the same phrase returned. He didn't fall. He stepped away. It was on the fourth night that the confessional door creaked open without footsteps. Malrick had not scheduled confession. No one had entered the church. Still, the booth door eased wide, slow as breath, and the curtain fell shut behind. Nothing. He stood frowning in the center aisle, staring. Then a faint sound, feathers brushing wood. When he finally dared approach, he opened the curtain, and there, resting on the seat, was a third feather, this one gray, smudged with ash, and beneath it, written in charcoal on the leather bench, "I remember Eden. I remember what they buried there." Malrick stumbled backward. His fingers were shaking so violently, he dropped his rosary. The beads scattered across the stone floor like bones. Antenna saw it, a shape behind the stained glass window. Not light, a figure, tall, wings drawn tight, watching, but not looking in, looking out, as if trapped inside the glass, watching the world forget. Malrick returned to the Bible. He had no choice. The page with the sigil had changed again. The ink had dried, but now it cracked, like old paint, and underneath was another name. Not a Gramiel, something older, something before names. Just a string of symbols, and a line written in trembling script beneath. "He is the memory of what God was before he was worshipped." That night, Father Malrick stood before the altar and said something he'd never dared to say. "I don't believe I'm meant to stop this." And that church, for the first time, responded. The bell above the steeple rang 13 times, and the final ring didn't echo. It descended, as if something had just landed inside the church. Episode 6: The 13th Bell. It shouldn't have rung. There had never been a 13th bell. The Tower of St. Anselm set 12 chimes for each disciple, each hour, each heavenly gate. But this sound, this 13th toll, it came from beneath, not from the steeple, from the crypt below the church floor, a place no one had entered in over 90 years. Sealed, blessed, forgotten. Father Malrick descended the staircase without thinking. Not from courage, from summoning. He clutched the final filigree and cracked it and carried only a single candle. The crypt was colder than death. Death didn't stir, air didn't breathe, yet something moved. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone slab, engraved with a symbol he recognized. The sigil, the one from the Bible, the one that pulsed, but now it was glowing, faintly, like breath under skin. He placed the feather at the center of the sigil, and instantly, the candle blew out. But the room didn't go dark. Instead, a soft light filled the crypt, rising not from the walls, but from a figure kneeling in the corner. At first, it looked human, then angelic. Man wrong. It had wing size, but torn, asymmetrical, one white, one black, both bent inward like they were trying to shield its own heart. Its mouth was covered by a seal drawn in ancient script, still glowing, still holding, but its eyes were open, and they looked at Malrick like they remembered everything he had ever doubted. He spoke without knowing why. A Gramiel. The figure didn't move, but behind Malrick, the stone slab began to crack, not explode, not collapse, split down the middle, like a page being torn from a book that no longer wanted to be read. A voice low, not from the mouthless being, but from inside Malrick's own chest spoke. He remembers before obedience, before angels served, before worship became control. Malrick turned to the figure. "What do you want?" he whispered. The angel didn't speak, but it showed him, in a flash of memory that wasn't his. Malrick saw a garden, but not Eden. Before Eden, a place where light didn't judge, where angels walked among men not as guards, but as equals. Before the word was weaponized, before shame was sewn into fig leaves, before names became prisons. And, ton, he saw the moment it all changed. A voice from above, commanding, absolute, and Adramiel refused to kneel, not in rebellion, but in sorrow, because he knew what kneeling would cost. And so we left, and heaven sealed his mouth, not to punish him, to make sure he could never remind the others what they used to be. Back in the crypt, the angel stood, no longer hiding, and Malric, with tears running down his face, whispered, "I believe you." And for the first time, Adramiel nodded, the seal on his mouth cracked. Episode 7. The mouth they sealed with fire. The crack was small, barely visible, but it split the seal across Adramiel's lips like a fault line under divine pressure. And for the first time in uncountable centuries, he exhaled, no words, just breath. But the room changed. The candles in the crypt burned to wax and ash lit themselves. Stone groaned underfoot, as if reacting to a memory too ancient for architecture to carry. And Father Malric, he fell to his knees, not in reverence, not in fear, but because something inside him, something older than his priesthood, remembered. Adramiel stepped forward, his chained wings tracked against the walls. One white, one black, neither clean. His eyes, glowing with the burden of millennia, looked into Malric without blinking. And then, the second crack, the seal splintered across his cheek, glowing red as it broke apart, as if it had been forged in holy fire, and was now failing in the presence of truth. Then the voice came, not loud, not commanding, mournful, a whisper that shook the soul more than thunder. I was there before the command, before the throne demanded knees, before names were weapons. Malric trembled. What are you saying? Adramiel turned his face toward the cracked stone ceiling, and one word escaped his mouth through. Trembling, beautiful, equal, and with it, a piece of heaven fell, literally, above that church. A single star went out. Telescopes would later report the anomaly, but no science could explain why. In one small corner of the sky, a light that had burned for thousands of years vanished. Inside the crypt, Adramiel knelt, the angel who had never bowed, not to God, not to the fall, but now to Malric, not as a priest, as a witness, a vessel. He placed his hand on Malric's chest, and the church above them began to shake. Dust rained down from the arches, statues cracked, and then the Bible locked beneath the altar burst open from within. Pages scattered, but one landed face up, a new verse, one that no translation had ever recorded. Not Old Testament, not Gnostic, not apocryphal, a verse written in ink that moved like breath. And when the angel remembered who he was, the heavens bent not in rage, but in shame. Adramiel whispered, "They made you fear us, but they feared what we knew." And, he smiled, not in peace, but in permission, because now that he had spoken, others could follow, and heaven could no longer pretend it had never silenced its own. Episode 8. The echo that reached the choir. The moment Adramiel spoke, something awakened in the world, not with fire, not with thunder, but with recognition. Far away, in a monastery buried under snow, a nun collapsed during silent prayer. Her eyes rolled back, and from her mouth came a name she'd never heard. Adramiel. In the Vatican archives, ancient scrolls long thought indecipherable suddenly began to translate themselves. Ink that had moved in centuries pulsed, lines shifted, and one phrase appeared at the margins of every page. He remembered the time before obedience, but it was the choir that truly felt it first. The cathedral in Marseille, known for its midnight hymns, was filled with over 100 voices. Yet when the organ played that night, no one could sing. Every singer opened their mouth and wept. No tears, only blood. The choirmaster collapsed at the podium. On his sheet music, every note had disappeared, leaving only 5 letters. ADRAM. He never wrote the rest. Back at St. Anselm's, Father Malric was losing his grip on what counted as reality. The church no longer behaved like stone. Its walls breathed. The stained glass windows bled faint red around the edges. Not shattered, just quietly leaking. And the Bible? It was no longer a book. It had become a mirror. Each time Malric opened it, it showed him something different. Not text, but truth. His childhood sin, his first real doubt, the sermon he gave while lying through his teeth. It was no longer scripture. It was accounting. And through it all, Adramiel stood silently beside the altar, not weeping, not warning, just watching, as if waiting to see who else would dare to listen. At exactly 3 a.m., the bell rang again, once, but this time, it was answered. From the hills surrounding the town, other bells began to chime, ones that hadn't rung in decades, abandoned churches, forgotten chapels, even a burned cathedral whose tower had collapsed in 1914. Its bell tolled, and every time it did, the name whispered again, Adramiel. Father Malric stood at the pulpit and whispered, "Why now?" Adramiel turned to him. For the first time, his eyes were glowing gold bright as sun through storm. He didn't speak, but Malric heard it anyway, because they'd been praying to silence long enough. And as he said it, down scenes of feathers began to fall from the ceiling. Not white, not black, gray, each one still warm, each one still trembling, as if other angels were waking up. Episode 9, The Choir Without Wings. The feathers did not fall. They descended slow, steady, deliberate. Each one carried weight not physical, but spiritual, as if they had once belonged to something that had seen too much, and was finally ready to return. Father Malric stood in the center aisle of St. Anselm's as they drifted around him. The air vibrated, not like thunder, like a memory humming at the edge of time. And, they began to sing, not the feathers, not Adramiel, but the air itself, a sound that wasn't voice, wasn't language, but understood. A melody of sorrow so ancient, it made the church windows fog. The organ in the canary plugged and onto shed began to play along. And in the front pew, a young girl no one had seen enter began to weep. She looked no older than 10. She held nothing, but her sobs were rhythmic, like a pulse, like liturgy. Adramiel turned toward her slowly, and Malric realized she was not crying from fear. She was remembering something. And then she whispered, in a voice that echoed louder than thunder, "They told me angels had wings, but they clipped their own, so they'd never fly back to the truth." That night, the Vatican issued a private memo. It was never meant to reach the public, but it did. 3 lines. Do not respond to the name. Do not acknowledge the feathers. Do not open the mirrors. By morning, thousands had TikTok flooded with videos of people seeing reflections that weren't theirs. As that blinked to slow, wings behind them in mirrors, even when they stood alone. Old churches began to hear knocking from their sealed crypts. Nuns awoke with sigils burned faintly into their palms. And above it all, the same note ran across continents. Adramiel, but something else began happening. Not chaos, not destruction, confession, unprovoked, raw, public. A bishop in Argentina live-streamed a secret he'd buried for 40 years. A famous televangelist tore up his own sermons on stage and said, "This wasn't written by God. This was written by fear." No judgment came, only light, and it wasn't warm. It was clarity. Back in St. Anselm's, Malric looked up. The Bible had turned to a new page. There were no verses, just a question. If the angels remember who they were, will humanity dare to do the same? Adramiel stepped forward, and for the first time, both of his wings unfurled, the black one no longer broken, the white one no longer bound. It said nothing, but every soul that looked at him heard the same silent hymn. Come back, not to worship, but to remember. Episode 10, The Memory They Buried in Stone. The girl was gone. No one saw her leave. No doors opened. No pew creaked. But where she had Saturday, one gray feather remained, still warm, still pulsing faintly, and etched into the wood beneath it, not by hand, but by something older than tools, were 5 words. We were not always silent. Father Malric stood in the nave, eyes fixed on Adramiel's fully unfurled wings. The church had stopped pretending it was just a building. The stained glass no longer reflected light. It projected memory. Visions danced on every wall like ghost-lit film, reels of forgotten truths. He saw flashes, a man kneeling, not to a cross, but to a mirror, an angel turning its back on a throne, a child reciting a prayer that had no God attached, only love. And then, the sound, a rumble, low and deep, not of thunder, but of something beneath earth shifting. The altar cracked, split clean down the middle. From it, not blood, not fire, but dust. Dust that moved like smoke. Dust that whispered. Malric knelt instinctively. not in worship, but in surrender. The dust curled around his face and formed a shape, a face, not divine, familiar, his own, younger, afraid. I used to believe everything, his own voice said from the dust, until they told me that doubt was sin. The voice was him, but it wasn't memory. It was recollection made physical. Adramiel approached, walking through the whispering dust. He spoke without lips again, but Malric understood. Every truth you buried in obedience is clawing its way back. Suddenly, the church bell rang again, but this time it was followed by another and another. From every direction, different tones, different timbres. Other churches were responding, not with hymns, with remembrance. People across the world began waking from dreams they'd never had before, dreams of angels without names, gardens without guilt, prayers that healed without doctrine. Some collapsed, some laughed, some wept and didn't know why. In Jerusalem, a rabbi saw the name Adramiel written in flame on his Torah scroll. In Cairo, a child pointed to the sky and said, "He's not falling, he's coming back." Back at St. Anselm's, Malric stood and whispered, "Why now?" Adramiel turned to him, and for the first time since his seal broke, he spoke aloud, not with thunder, with grief, with beauty, because memory is louder than command. And as he said it, the foundation of the church trembled again. Only this time, it wasn't from below, it was from above, as if something in heaven had just heard him speak and remembered what they tried to forget. Episode 11. When heaven looked down and hesitated, the first crack appeared in the sky above St. Anselm's at exactly 3:33 a.m. Not thunder, not lightning, just a thin line barely visible splitting the clouds like glass under pressure. Father Malric saw it first. The stars around the crack shimmered, then blinked out. Not all at once, one by one, as if even the cosmos was afraid to watch what came next. Inside the church, Adramiel stood with both ways unfurled, arms open not in surrender, but in invitation. Around him, the air shimmered with heat that didn't burn. The feathers that had fallen earlier began to rise slowly, circling him like memories learning how to breathe again. And then, the second sign, the silence broke, not from Adramiel, from above. A sound fell into the world like glass shattering in slow motion. It wasn't a voice, it was a withdrawal, a divine silence, pulling back. Heaven was listening, and it didn't like what it heard. Far away, in cities that hadn't prayed in decades, ancient cathedrals began to tremble. Stone saints cracked, painted angels faded, and in one cathedral in Prague, a fresco of the Last Judgment began to bleed from its eyes. Scholars tried to explain it. They failed, because something had returned. Not evil, not prophecy, memory. The angels remembered, and with remembering came free will. Some chose to remain silent, others began to fall, not in rebellion. In reunion, they didn't plummet in fire, they descended in stillness, as if they had heard Adramiel's name and remembered who they were before they bowed. At St. Anselm's, Father Malric knelt again, only this time, he wasn't praying, he was bearing witness. The church roof cracked open, not collapsed, just peeled back, like heaven itself wanted to look down for the first time in centuries. And above them, not clouds, winds, endless, overlapping, layered wings, some radiant, some tattered, all trembling, not in anger, in uncertainty, because heaven had always spoken in absolutes. Until now, Adramiel stepped forward, his voice, no longer sealed, echoed in every soul present in or unseen. If heaven is afraid to listen, then perhaps heaven has forgotten who it serves. A single feather lifted from his shoulder and caught for it in destruction, but in transformation. And from that flame came words that did not exist in any human tongue, but every heart understood them, even the angels above. And as they heard it, they hesitated, not in rage, in remorse, and the crack in the sky widened, not as punishment, as invitation. Episode 12. The throne without a name. The sky didn't tear, it yielded, like something once sealed by force was now stepping aside slowly, reluctantly, reverently. Father Malric couldn't move. He didn't need to. The moment had moved into him. Every breath felt ancient, every blink carried weight. Above him, the open sky no longer showed stars, but winds, so many, layered like pages of an unread gospel. Adrenal stood at the altar, light rippling around him, not divine light, but memory made visible. It shimmered in every color Malric had never seen. Like truth had colors that only return when fear leaves the room. And then the others came, one by one. Angels descended, not fallen, not summoned, caught by the echo of a name they had been forbidden to remember. Adramiel. They had once known him as brother. Some had watched in silence as his mouth was sealed. Others had helped tie the knot themselves as believing it righteous. Now they stood beside him, not speaking, just present. That was enough. And, the sky above them opened one final time, and something stirred, not God, not the devil, but something deeper, a throne, not made of gold, not surrounded by fire, a void, shaped like a seat, empty, waiting. Malric whispered, "Where is he?" Adramiel turned to high, my soft voice steady. He never Saturday there. The wind stopped, the world stopped, even the angels stopped. The throne was never his place. It was ours. All of us, meant to be shared, meant to be empty, until we forgot and built worship instead of wonder. The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Malric's knees gave out, not from fear, from release. Everything he had believed, everything he had feared was not being erased. It was being rewritten, and then the Bible, resting on the cracked altar, opened once more. No hands touched it, no one flipped its pages. It simply obeyed memory. And on the final pageant that had never existed before was a verse. He who fears no name remembers who he was before the stars were counted. The crack in the sky pulsed, and from its center, a single beam of light struck the earth. Not burning, not blinding, just asking. Malric looked up, and in that moment, he wasn't a priest. He was a boy again, kneeling beside his bed, whispering a question he had never dared voice aloud. Is it true that angels can cry? Wow, he knew, and soon, everyone would, because the final truth wasn't coming. It had already begun. Episode 13, the name that was never meant to be spoken. The light did not fall. It waited. It stood like a question above the earth, above St. Anselm's, above every trembling soul that had dared to listen. It didn't demand, it offered, and in the stillness beneath that beam, Father Malric stepped forward, not as priest, not as servant, but as a man who had finally stopped fearing the sound of his own soul. Behind him, the other angels stood silent. Adramiel at the center, his wings fully restored, his voice unsealed, his memory intact, and above them, the throne, still empty, still pulsing with something that wasn't presence, but invitation. Malric spoke aloud to heaven, not to God, but to everyone listening. We were told to obey, told to kneel, told to never ask who we were before the silence. But the silence was never sacred. It was strategic. He turned to Adramiel. The angel nodded once, and, Adramiel raised his hand toward the sky. From his palm, a name appeared, not spoken, not written, but known. A name no scripture ever dared preserve. A name that had been cut from every tongue, every psalm, every sacred library. The true name, the one even angels feared, because it wasn't above them. It included them. Malric gasped, not in fear, in recognition, and for the first time in his life, he understood. The lie wasn't that God was above. The lie was that we were ever beneath. The throne cracked, not from blasphemy, from truth, because the power of divinity had never been in distance or dominance. It was in memory, and memory had returned. Across the world, churches lit without flame. Mirrors no longer reflected faces. They reflected origin. People wept without knowing why. And above the earth, where the throne once hovered in empty expectation, it folded in on itself, collapsed like a star that had outlived its illusion. And in its place, light, not holy, shed. The sky did not fall. It opened, and every human, woman, child, broken, faithful, faithless was touched by the same whispered truth. You were never meant to kneel. You were meant to remember. Adramiel turned to Malric one final time. His voice was quiet, final, free. Now the name is yours. Malric did not speak it, he became it.